Now this is a fun video to do. This is the Soviet Naval Aviation Doctrine, and honestly, one of the things I decided to do when starting off this video is I'm not going to just do the World War II period, because Soviet Naval Aviation Doctrine is remarkably homogeneous both prior to, during, and post World War II. In fact, honestly, you can say it has the same problems it's wrestling with for its entirety of its life expectancy. And you can say it's also dealing with the same handicaps, and it's trying to overcome them often in the same ways. One of the things that you are going to notice differently is that I'm not going to be referencing too many specific people. There is a reason for this. If you read books which, let's say, are written in the 1930s, they will credit them to some people. Then, after those people were blacklisted, the books in 1940 credit the same things to different people. And then if you read the same books in the 1970s, they credit them to different people entirely. And then there's the modern books, which credit them to a completely different set of people, but claim they've done the true research, and therefore they know the real people involved. The trouble is, there is just so much claim and counterclaim, so much rewriting of history because people are expunged, and then people are unexpunged, so they're rewritten into history and given different things, that honestly, we cannot really attribute things to specific people. We can to an extent, and I will try to where I can. But I'm not. If I did a video which was entitled "The People Involved in Soviet Naval Aviation Development," it would be a long list of this person might have done this or this or this, but then under this regime they were said not to have done any of that. And it was all credited to this person and this person, and you get the point. It would be an entire video of me basically going, but it's kind of like the Kamchatka. It's almost a meme of itself, and that's a problem for the Soviets, because their political issues aside, and their internal political issues very much aside, they are actually at some of the forefront of naval aviation. They really are. Russia, Imperial Russia, is one of the first nations to actually push forward with naval aviation. They're one of the first. They have lots of very influential people and princes involved who are very keen on naval aviation, very keen on it as an offset strategy. And this is the point about them chasing a solution. They are 70 years trying to chase a solution of how to solve their lack of investment in naval capability. Now, I did recently have a comment on this channel which was along the lines of, why does Russia even bother having a navy? Well, we'll get into that. But basically, Russia has huge coastlines. And Russia gets really, really scared of being invaded. You could say that's because they've invaded so many people themselves while forming their empire. Because let's be honest, Russia was an empire long before it became a federation or anything else. You could say that's a legacy of World War II. And the sheer horror which Stalin and a lot of his generation had over the invasion. But there again, Napoleon's done that to them in the past. But with Napoleon, they pulled some tricks on him. There was a lot of worry that Hitler had pulled the tricks on them with the World War II. Ultimately, the sea is your strategic depth. It's your safety. But the trouble for the Soviets and the Russians before them is that with such huge land borders, the army always has to come first. Because let's be honest, invading someone across the land or across sea, the land is always easier. Land is always easier. There are entire books about problems of people with invading across the sea. So if the land is always easier, and that's the key thing here. If the land is always easier, therefore you must always defend the land first. And that's where your army comes in. So that's always going to be taking your primary funding. So how do you have sufficient sea power when your Navy is not going to get your primary funding. And you're not necessarily large enough to give the Navy enough funding even in the first place, because your economy might not be broad enough. Well, there are problems. You can either do consistent investment over a long time with consistently the ship pushing consistent goals, so you develop a core strong capability that, whilst is not perfect in all ways, is adaptable and is flexible on that core and is able to project within that core. Or you keep chasing the future as an offset. You keep chasing the next thing. Now, here's the thing. The classic example of this is the aircraft carrier, because everyone has been promising since the aircraft carrier came into existence that it's going to be wiped out in the next war by this new weapon system. And there is always a possibility they're right. But so far, the lessons of history show that the air carrier air group and the carrier itself and the battle group around it adapt. That the weapon systems don't prove nearly as perfect as they might imagine, and that, frankly, they're often seen coming a lot longer than they actually are. One of the joys is modern hypersonics. People talk about hypersonic weapons and how scary they are. And, well, if they're maneuvering at hypersonic speeds, then, frankly, their maneuvering takes up such a long distance, they're probably going to miss you anyway. If they're coming in a straight line, well, if they're coming towards you, that's rather like ballistic missiles and all sorts of things that we've been planning and dealing with since the Cold War. And again, the Soviet Union keeps chasing these things. Massive missiles, massive bombardment of capabilities, overwhelming defenses. And so that's actually something we've been designing for a while, and the Soviets keep trying to look for systems which can give them this advantage. It's not just the Soviets, though, which fall for that. In fact, the Soviets don't fall for the one which some of the Western nations fell for. This is a Type 22 frigate. The Royal Navy built them. You might notice there's something missing from it. It's got no deck gun. It's got entirely missile armament. Because missiles were the future. Falklands War and a few other things afterwards, and there's no ship being produced since which hasn't got a main deck gun. Because of its general purpose utility. You see, the thing is, on paper, the missiles are brilliant. They're amazing. They will give you these guaranteed kills. But they're not really a flexible thing, because a missile is either an anti-ship weapon, anti-aircraft weapon, or land attack weapon. Now, I know the standard missile does have an anti-ship capability. It does. It does some very nasty things, but that's very much a secondary role. And honestly, if you're using your standard missiles as anti-ship missiles, the question is, A, have you run out of other systems, and B, what else has gone wrong? Because theoretically you need to save those for your sea-air battle, or air-sea battle, depending on how you want to phrase it. So chasing the future is not a uniquely Soviet problem, or uniquely anyone's problem. Everyone has this symptom, everyone has this, but different nations fall prey to it in different ways. And what's interesting for the Soviet naval aviation is that despite being at the forefront of naval aviation, despite having some really cool ideas for aircraft carriers for a long time, it takes them a long time to actually get into aircraft carriers, because in many regards, aircraft carriers are viewed as the other, as the symbol of the other powers. And undermining, defeating them by not having them and showing their and suggesting their points, etc., is a core part of their national identity at certain points. And this is a real problem because of what the challenge they're set. The challenge they're set is to defend all of this. Now, some of that may be Arctic, some of that may be ice. Yes, a lot of that's ice. But there be liquid there. There be liquid over there. There be liquid up there. And that's a problem. You see, you have a problem which the US Navy had faced prior to the Panama Canal. You have a problem which arguably the Royal Navy would have faced if the Suez Canal had never existed. How do you police all these oceans, all these seas? How do you protect your nation in all these waters if your fleets cannot join up? If you have any number of fleet, your fleet is automatically divided pretty much into 3 separate formations. The Northern Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, and the Pacific Fleet. There's also a couple of boats on the Caspian Sea. It's pretty much impossible. It's one of the things of, on paper, you can look at the Russian fleet and the Russo-Japanese War, and they should curb stomp the Japanese. Then you look at the actual forces they have available at any one time. The Russian fleet's all over the world. The Japanese fleet is concentrated. But if they don't have a fleet, then their defensive depth becomes their coastline. And that's a problem. The biggest problem for that, and this is an ongoing problem, especially as the nuclear age comes in, is once you get into the ballistic missile submarine base, ballistic missile submarine sort of operational, especially as your war ender, what you have to remember with the Soviet nuclear doctrine, pretty much it fits into two. You've got the strike capability, which is the land-based systems, the aerial systems, and then you've got the ballistic missile submarines, which are considered your ability to end the war if it carries on. Because they're going to be hidden and they are the most survivable. So they are the arm which you use to end the war. To go, look, we stop now, or we tend to fire these. How much is going to be surviving after the rest are being fired, we'll leave to one side, but that was the idea. And so, for that reason, you need to make sure they are survivable. That becomes a problem. Making sure they're survivable. Making sure they work. Because, you see, you've got the Sea of Otosk, and you've got... and the Barents Sea for the Northern Fleet, which are these sort of bastions which they deploy and they want to use to secure those ballistic missile submarines. And that means they have to take their old ideas of how they were going to defend and provide themselves with strategic and defensive depth at sea and extend it further. That's what finally breaks them of the no aircraft carriers are not useful. No aircraft carriers not necessarily, they're just targets in war vibe, and they start building aircraft carriers. But when they start out, they have a lot of old equipment, and that's one of their troubles. And one of their troubles throughout their history of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Naval Aviation is they are very... how do I put this? They do not like to get rid of equipment. If it still works, they want to keep it. Now, part of that is the constant battle to get new equipment. Let's be honest, of the aviation branches, they are probably the one which is the lowest down the totem pole in some regards. Highest in others, but lowest in some, especially when it comes to fighting the political battles. They also have a problem if that some new programs, entire projects can be destroyed because one person falls out of favour. And that project is seen as too associated with that person, so therefore it's the fruit of a poison tree. And it's all gone. And as said, they have too many coastlines. And what works for one might not work for another. Let's be honest, the aircraft you need for providing cover in the Caspian Sea is very different to the Black Sea, is completely different to the Baltic, is not the same as the Barents Sea and Northern Fleet's going to face, and probably the Pacific Fleet is just going to want everything it can get. Literally everything it can get its hands on. They're all needed, though. But it is a different methodology they will be going with. It is a different system they have to form themselves around. Before we get too much into that, let's move on to a shameless book plug. Yes. Well, I have many reasons to be shamelessly plugging books. One, it promotes my books and gets them sold, which is always a good thing for an academic, so I get promoted. Two, for those who don't know, this is the season when you get your notifications of how much tax you're going to have to be paying in January. I did not cry, but let's put it this way, I have enough Scottish and Cornish in my genetic makeup that I was honestly silent for a few minutes. We will survive. We will survive. So much. So many books I could buy with that money. Leaving that to one side. And also, I am setting up this office. Now, believe it or not, here's a fun thing. I realised that all the money that I'm fundraising, anything that comes out, is basically going to Clarke's and things, setting up this office. And, yeah. It's when you realise that you have roughly 10 Clarke's, and I have just about finished emptying the boxes from the brew shack from my old office. Which if you've never seen, if you go back to the old videos from a few months ago, you'll see that I was completely books all round. I built the shelves myself. I didn't realise quite how many books they held. And when you realise all these Clarke's around me are double stacked, there are 2 layers of books on each shelf. Because most I can get into both sides of them, so it doesn't really matter. I can wander around both sides and go, oh, there's my books. Some of them are single stacked where the books are important, but they're mostly double stacked. Yeah, you realise how many books I had in there. And I still got more boxes to go. This is going to be a good office. It's basically going to be a library, but it's going to be a good office. Just need to pay the tax bill. Oh. So let's start off with the 1920s, because officially it's formed in 1918 for the Russian Civil War. That's officially when it comes about, when Soviet naval aviation starts. And whilst not always the numerically most important in terms of numbers allocated, often the most important in terms of reliability and actual utility are the Gregorich M11s and M12s, which if you can tell apart from a photo, then you're a better soul than I am. Or rather, than any of the photos I have managed to find of them. They are intriguing little aircraft. But the fact is, the Russians had a lot of flying boats, a lot of seaplanes. And the reason for this was infrastructure. One of the big problems you have when you are Russia and you're organizing these things is investing in infrastructure, because it all costs a lot of money and you have to build it everywhere. Remember, all those areas of water which need to be covered. And the major things they are for is, well, reconnaissance, patrol. They do actually have some dogfights with the Germans during World War One. They have had that. And in the Civil War, there are some dogfights again. You know, that these aircraft are mixing up, but they are part of trying to provide that defensive depth. And the first stage of defensive depth is reconnaissance, is patrol, is knowing what's out there, is having an idea of what's coming towards you. And that's basically the problem for the Soviets for a lot of history, is policing the seas, basically. And that's part of Navy's jobs. That's part of the functions, but it's also a function which is kind of hard to sell. Because you think if you're on land, you stick a watchtower there on the border, some watchtowers, and you have some guards sitting there, and that's quite an easy thing to do. You can support them and sustain them fairly easily. There might even be local shops they can go and buy their food at, so you don't even have to do a logistics line if you want to, if you're really being lazy. But for maritime patrol, for patrolling the seas, you need more than that. You need aircraft to be going out, you need ships to be going out, you need this presence. And pretty much these assets are what they have. They are working a lot in the 1920s with what they have. There are lots of discussions, and lots of aircraft are listed as entering service in the 1920s. When you look at the actual numbers which are in service in the 1920s versus the early 1930s, you start to realise that whilst theoretically this is on the list, it might not be there in numbers necessary to actually sustain anything. But they were trying. There's also the constant fights for dominance and control over aviation assets, we like to, again, in the UK, sometimes pretend our history with the Royal Air Force and the issues when they first of all have it, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service, and then they combine and put everything under one house, and then they break it off again just prior to World War II. So the other services have the air components which directly support them are now part of them again, because it makes sense, because for some reason an air service which is about air defence of the UK towards the end of the 1930s, when they suddenly realise with radar it is a viable option, or strategic bombing, might not prioritise the needs of the of combat air support for the other services. Because there's always a funding battle, both internal and external within the forces, between the forces, within the forces, the individual forces, and within the whole wider government. There's always funding battles. There's always justifications for spending a lot of money. They are not small sums being spent. So there's going to be these fights. But it's also where the Soviet doctrine really starts to come together for naval aviation. Their doctrine is very much, this is about their layers of defense. And when we talk about the Bastion program, that's often seen as a Cold War idea with the ballistic missile submarines, as I started off by discussing, but it's something which has been coming a long time. A lot of Soviet development and Soviet doctrine and theory around naval and maritime sphere is very, very focused on, how do I put this politely and sensibly, very focused on providing that security, providing that the defense in depth, that ability to defend themselves, because they realized very quickly that communism was not popular, both internally and externally. That other governments there might be individuals in those governments who like the idea of communism, but the vast majority of other governments did not like the idea of communism. They realized very quickly they were not going to be necessarily a pariah state, but were going to be one of the states which was viewed, how do I put this, in a quizzical manner, constantly examined. And when you start hearing their commitments to spreading communism around the world, etc., that they often were talking about in their speeches and their big grandiose statements, then you can sort of understand why those other governments are looking at them going, sounds like you're a version of imperialism by another name. Once you start wanting to spread it around the world and form everyone into a global communist government. Yeah. So they realized they're at risk. Really, the interesting stuff starts to happen in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there are a lot of developments that start to come about, and you even have things like the Shitterov MDR-6, etc., flying boat. And again, flying boats continue because of infrastructure. Seaplanes, flying boats, they're infrastructure you can easily put in as a navy. They are things you can easily support from existing naval bases. You don't have to build anything separate. You don't have to try and get that through the other organizations in the region. Which might seem strange, but it's the case. Do you want to have to fight with the local agricultural Comintern and etc. and all the other different people over what you are using some of their land for an airfield? Prior to World War II, that might not work out well for you. During World War II, you can do pretty much what you like, but prior to World War II, no. You might lose that. It's going to depend on who the local political higher-ups support. And that might depend not on who's making the best case, but who supplies them with the best vodka. Or is married to one of their children, or is an old friend of their father's, or all those things. And in the mid-1930s also saw the introduction, this is around the mid-1930s, There are dates given, and again, some of those dates get revised in different books, and it depends on how you think. It's like the Soviet Naval Aviation birthday and the birthday for the Russian Naval Aviation. There's whole fights over them because you see, this is the official ones where the ceremony is done, but also sometimes they date it from when there was the first air-to-air combat between them and some probably aircraft of the Kaiserliche Marine from the accounts. Pretty much, it's a whole other debate. It's something when your own birthday is up for a public debate. We'll leave that to one side though. But it's also, there is always the scenario of official birthdays versus real birthdays. Let's be honest. In the UK, I can't really critique that. We have monarchs who always have an official birthday and their actual birthday. And let's be honest, that is something which I'm surprised more people do not do. I like the idea of having both an official birthday and a real birthday. Double the chance of presents. Double the chance of books to be sent to me. Sounds a good thing, doesn't it? So, basically what happens in this period is they start going, right, we want to establish this, but we need different things. The Black Sea we need to dominate. The Black Sea, it becomes a sort of bastion, but it's not a bastion. It's a bastion thanks to the Straits of Dardanelles and the fact that if you reinforce your forces there, you can dominate the Black Sea. And if you dominate it, that is your defensive depth. That is your sea, which is an impassable barrier for anyone to attack from those angles, which gives you defensive depth. And also, you can maneuver assets through that sea. The one trouble is, it's kind of like the Caspian, it's kind of closed in. So whilst in theory, it's the best place to base your ships and everything for having access to constant warm weather ports, or rather warm water ports in that they are not usually iced over. In effect, you are the big fish in a small pond. You are going to be in charge, but you can't really do anything with being in charge. Doesn't really help you anywhere in anything else. Kind of the same when we come to the Baltic. The Baltic is one of the reasons why they get really obsessed with strategic bombers, because they basically have the idea of bombing everyone else's naval base as a way of suppressing the enemy opponent's capabilities. You can attack their ships at sea. Yay, torpedo bombers for that one. Dive bombers also could be quite a good idea. But, you know, what you really want to do is bomb their base, and then they can't do anything. They can't project power if they have no infrastructure to project power from. That's the whole thing. That's a good idea. That works. And again, it's about defense and depth. But then you sort of look at the Pacific, and you look at the Northern Fleet, and those aren't really viable options. You can dominate the Black Sea. You can maybe suppress the Baltic on paper. I'm fairly sure the Swedish and the Finnish and the Danish and the Polish and the Germans and the Baltic states themselves, Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, will have a word about that, but let's be honest, as what happens historically, the Baltic states find they are fighting a losing battle versus an overwhelming ground forces, and Finland turns into the Winter War, which is one of the most vicious conflicts ever seen by mankind. And that's saying something. But the thing is, the land borders mostly went the way the Soviets thought they would, but the sea borders, suppressing the enemy, that requires a lot more force than they were able to get. A lot more force than they were able to build up at the time. But the Shchevrokov MDR-6 is a really cool little aircraft. It does look like a short Sunderland at the front. Honestly, that does look like a bit of a short Sunderland design at the front. But it is not. It's just the way they, when you want to make a flying boat and you want to have a turret at the front, they turn out looking like that. They really do. So we have the Zveno project, and this is a good example of this trying to build a defense in depth, trying to build a naval aviation which is going to support your naval forces when they're out operating, but also be able to project power themselves. And the idea was you attach parasite fighters to your bombers. Now, one of the things that always worries me with this project is they say that they had the attaching of the aircraft has no effect on the aerodynamical performance of the bombers. Now, this is often marketed as being a good thing, and I've read many, many books, and this is just... I've got 2 piles of books here. I'm not going to lift out both piles, but this is just one pile of the books I have next to me for this, and lots and lots of books on the Soviet Navy. Andrew Boyd's new book on arms for Russia and a naval war in the Arctic, which is a really cool read. Really good read. I'm going to do that in a book review video. Might ask him to do a video or something. And Russia Looks to the Sea by David Fairhall. All these are just some of the books I've been looking at. I'm not going to do the other pile. But the point is, once you start reading through those books, they often do come with the points, the Russians are making about these systems. And one of the key ones that comes up is that the Russians noted there was no significant detrimental impact on the flying capabilities and the aerial performance and handling of the bomber aircraft with the fighters attached. Now, that can mean 2 things to me, that phraseology. That can mean there was none, or that the handling properties of the bombers before the fighters were attacked was already so terrible that frankly it didn't make it much worse. Now, when you start to look at the accident reports and the maintenance reports and other issues these aircraft, especially the Tupolev TB3, has, the impression I would go with the latter one, but I might be being skeptical here, I do admit. The point is, though, they were trying it, and they were trying to improve things. They were trying to get better, and they were working to get better. They were putting a lot of investment, they had a lot of design bureaus, they had a lot of different engineers working with groups of engineers, leading these projects, trying to make things better. And sometimes, let's be honest, some design bureaus, they produce pretty much nothing. If I'm not mistaken, the aircraft featured on the previous page, the Shcheto-Vereikov MDR-6, was the only aircraft designed successfully by the design bureau of Igor Shiratorov. And it's an interesting design bureau. It's an interesting organization. And, well, Shcheto-Vereikov ends up with his design bureau being closed in 1948 and transferred to teaching work. He produced some interesting designs, but the only one which was actually ever successful was this one, which there are 27 built, and its nickname was the Mug. I'm not gonna even go into there. But yeah, the Soviets are trying. They are developing naval aviation, they're trying to push it forward, and the idea constantly is about providing support and reconnaissance for the naval units, and maritime patrol, but also strike to suppress. And they're trying to encapsulate all these roles. And they do have aircraft which come in and fulfill these roles. I've already done a key aircraft series. In Key Aircraft Series 2, I've already done a video about the Ilyushin DB3 and the Ilyushin Il-4, or DB3F. Now, DB, of course, stands for Daliny Bondarvershak 3, or Long Range Bomber 3. And the interesting things that comes about with these aircraft is that it's often the Soviet naval aviation long-range bomber forces which carry out the long-range strike missions in World War II for the Soviet Union, and are the ones who hit them. They are the ones who carry out the first long-range strike on Germany, etc., and things like that. Because They're actually trained for it. Now, this has also led to problems because the Soviet Navy and the Soviet Naval Aviation suffered the whole way through history, or their history, of being a lot of suspicion because they're the ones who go out and meet the Westerners the most often, the other people's most often, because their ships go and do ship visits and they're severely watched for doing that. And they've got aircraft which actually exist to fly off beyond the Soviet Union. They automatically are flying out. So, who are the people who are most worried about maybe defecting with the new bomber? Well, it's the Naval Aviation crews who already are flying out into the blue yonder. That's what they're supposed to do. So you watch them heavily. They come with other interesting ideas. There are the various policies put forward at various points. And at one point, they were for bomber crews and long-range flight crews. They were looking for only for married men with children. Because the idea was that if your wife and kids were back there, you wouldn't defect. I'm not sure how successful that policy was. It doesn't seem to have been kept in place for very long. But it's some of the ideas they try out to keep the aviation under that control, and because you require a very unique blend of personality. If they're going to go out and do these long-range maritime patrols, you're looking for people who are confident operating alone and being independent. However, those are also the people most likely to be independent thinkers who might think about the political regime and decide that they don't like it. And again, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? You have to hope. You have to do a lot of work with them. You have to make sure that they are very proud and national. You have to put nationalism there and all sorts of things to try and make it so that they are very attached to their country. And you often, in the case of Soviet Naval Aviation, this was another problem they had. They had to try and make sure they had a good standard of life. That they had the amenities and the advantages which were going to mean their standard of life they felt was good. Now, again, with these capabilities, they are talking about producing a strike range. They are talking about producing this strategic depth. We can patrol this area. If the enemy shipping is detected in this area, we can organize a strike. And at this range, we can take a strike of this strength, this number of aircraft, but also they can take this many bombs. If the range is closer, those aircraft can carry more bombs, so we might be able to add more aircraft. So basically, it will get more intensive the closer you get to the Soviet Union. That matters. That matters because a lot of the ideas of how they're supposed to do these operations are supposed to deter others from wanting to push closer to the Soviet Union. They want to keep you as far away as possible. Now, that of course works as long as your range of your battle groups is defined by the range of guns. Aircraft will normally, if they are not designed right, outrange guns. That's their advantage. They are shells which will fly a lot further than you can fire. But there's a problem for that. There is a problem, and this has been coming through the 1920s and the 1930s. Aircraft carriers. Now, in the 20s and 30s, you have lots of issues with the power-to-weight ratio of the engines being developed, and the fact that aircraft operated from carriers need to be significantly structurally stronger than the ones operating even from rugged land bases. And so they are, working these things through, these limitations. But everyone can see the way aircraft are going. They're getting stronger, they're getting more capable. And there is no surprise that it's in the 1930s, 1940s, that the Soviets start looking at aircraft carriers. And realistically, this is the period where Stalin is at the peak of his power, and Stalin is pushing his big fleet. And why is he pushing his big fleet? Is it to project communism around the world? Yes, you can argue from a diplomacy perspective, a naval diplomacy perspective, it certainly is. But more importantly, it's about the power and status of the Soviet Union, about showing the strength of the Soviet Union, about raising the level of force required to interfere within the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. But the biggest thing about it is actually securing that sphere of influence by allowing you to protect and project its maritime borders and its maritime areas. Because if you can't, if those areas are porous, who knows what they can get up to. Remember, this is a man who goes through World War II and gets regular reports on what the American submarines are up to versus the Japanese, and what the British submarines are up to, and what the British carrier fleet's up to, and what the American carrier fleets are up to, and what the fleets are doing. They're his allies. They're reporting and telling him what they are getting up to. There are occasionally even Soviet naval officers and Soviet attaches on with these missions to observe, to spot amphibious warfare so they can see how they can integrate it. He has just seen D-Day launched, the world's largest river crossing. Please note, there's a reason I'm calling it river crossing, not amphibious operation. Amphibious operations are ship to shore. D-Day, because of the range and because of the size of it and because it's being conducted, is pretty much a shore-to-shore operation, where the ships are leaving one shore, dropping off another shore. So technically, according to standards, it's a river crossing, not amphibious operation, but it's also the world's largest amphibious operation. It's just, yeah. This, by the way, if you're not U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Army, you won't get involved. You won't get into the whole joke over it, but that's a fun one. If you want to start a fight between some U.S. Marines and U.S. Army personnel, you get them debating whether the D-Day was a river crossing or an amphibious operation. Army will claim it's an amphibious operation. Marines will claim it's a river crossing. And you can just sit back and watch the arguments fly. It's fun. It is. But for the Soviet Union, it doesn't matter whether it's a large river crossing or an amphibious operation. It was massive. And the scale of commitment and capability it represented was absolutely horrifying. Because, again, go back to all this coast. All this coast. And yes, you can go, well, Alex, no, the Black Sea doesn't count. They can't do that in there. Probably not. And the Baltic, it's not really going to be necessary. And it's not going to be the Caspian Sea. And you go, well, the Northern Sea area, no, the North Atlantic area, that's far too cold. But it is a lot of coastline. And there are options there. And the same with the Pacific. If you're paranoid enough, you can see the possibilities. If you're paranoid enough. And you have to remember, one of the key things about being in intelligence or in defense and national security, you're not paid to ask whether you're paranoid. You're paid to ask whether you're paranoid enough. Because you're looking after national security. You're looking after the safety of your nation. Combine that with a dictator, and dictators are notoriously paranoid. Well, yeah, there's a lot of options there, and there's a worry about the defensive depth. But the thing is, the people who come after Stalin are land-orientated, I would say, but also they are more worried about control. Stalin's in power long enough. He's built up enough of a personal following that he's prepared to take some risks. Which seems very strange when talking about Stalin, who is a very, very conservative operator in terms of the amount of risk he's prepared to function under. But he is prepared to take limited amount of risks in terms of he believes that his personal cult has added on to the Soviet communist cult and ideology and has managed to make things more stable and loyal to him. Now, we can talk about certain frigates and certain actions during the Cold War, but honestly, he's not too far off. If at any point the Soviet Union was going to develop a carrier battle group and battleship force which was going to challenge what would become the NATO powers' control of the world's waters and dominance in world waters, this was the period they could do it. With Stalin's support, they could actually achieve it. Without his support, there was never a chance it was going to happen. To evolve from a defensive / diplomatic gunboat force to an actual romping, stomping, blue water, contesting control of the world's oceans fleet, this is the period. Post-World War II, while Stalin's still in power. And interesting enough, for this period, naval aviation is fluctuating between those two roles, those two missions. They're talking about fighters. This is why not much comes into being in this period, because they are developing a lot of ideas because they don't know what they're going to be going on. And that's a problem. If not much is coming through, it means you don't have much to base things on. There are some things coming through. Again, flying boats, which is sort of a constant when it comes to Soviet naval aviation. Flying boats keep turning up, and they make, again, a lot of sense, because pretty much everywhere you're talking about, you can base them in some way. You can base and operate them in some way. And they're useful for reconnaissance, for dealing with all the little islands you have, for dealing with all the little logistics you have for maybe outposts on those islands. They are really fundamentally a useful asset to have. Admittedly, once you start getting into the world of having larger helicopters, etc., then maybe you can go, well, do we need these things? And our helicopters can land on water. You can land on water and you can land on water. You can land on water. Are you likely to take off again? Well, help of a crane. And you can land on water. Are you going to take off again? Yeah, we should be fine. But flying boats, they're useful. They're still in service. Russia today still has on its books quite a considerable number of flying boats. And there are reasons for that. Same reason as the Japanese can retain them. Maritime patrol. Being able to rescue people from some of the waters and some parts of the world where they get into trouble. All these things come under maritime patrol. And yes, they're being developed because it doesn't matter whether you are going for a carrier arm and global power projection, and massive defense in depth, or whether you're trying to just do shore-based defense in depth, or shore projected and supported defense in depth. You'll see flying boats are useful. Maritime reconnaissance is never going to go out of fashion. It's always going to be something which requires your attention. And the fact that more countries don't retain this capability often surprises me. When I start thinking about it and thinking it through, this is something which is useful. I can see why nations which maybe are sort of sitting on the Mediterranean or something like that don't retain their capability, but nations like Britain, Japan does retain the capability. America, consider all their coastline. Canada, it'd be kind of useful to have some of these. They're useful things to have, but they do require maintenance, they do require funding, and they do require commitment. And if you're going to be honest, from a flying performance perspective and long-range maritime patrol perspective in terms of the aerial performance and the aircraft, more often than not, the regular planes, the converted airliners, are far better for that job. They give you the range, they give you the distance. And they're cheaper to run, cheaper to operate. So yeah, it makes sense from a cost perspective to have more of those aircraft and maybe have the ability to drop life rafts, etc., and things out from them, so that they can drop those to people, and so then someone else can go pick them up. But still, I like flying boats. And I think if you start to think about operations in what I would call island areas, what some people call, and I love this, they call them porous littoral areas, which is a phrase I heard yesterday, I must admit. And I went, can you please explain that to me? Oh yes, we see littorals are about the coastline and approaching the coast. Porous littoral areas are where there are lots of coastlines, like islands. Now, I did look at that person through the computer screen and wonder what had driven them to a point in the world where they had come up with that definition. But they have come up with that definition, and apparently it's being used. In those areas, I would say flying boats are incredibly useful because of the logistics they can sustain. They can be used to deliver things. Because of the fact that they can operate from those bases with minimal support from those islands, because literally you're just sticking probably some fuel bowsers underwater. Having a pipeline going to a position where you can refuel the boat, and then it takes off from the water. And honestly, it might never actually come ashore. It's a very deniable presence. It's a useful asset. And the Soviet Union keeps pushing them. But what comes about in the 1950s? Well, in the 1950s, what come about mainly are the badger and the bear. Or rather, the badger and the bear. The Tupolev. They become the undisputed kings, lords of long-range maritime patrol and strike. The 216 Badger comes in various forms, reconnaissance. It's usually the 295s, which are modified for strike command roles, because they have all these ideas of what you're going to have coming out is strike wings of bombers armed with missiles or whatever system they're coming with. At this point, they get upgraded and upgraded and carry bigger and bigger missiles as time goes on. And you're going to have a reconnaissance screen of aircraft out hunting the carrier battle groups and the forces. They will find them, then they'll report their information, and then the strike will come through, and there'll be a command aircraft forward coordinating all these assets to bring them in, and trying to coordinate submarine assets and surface assets and everything else they can get hold of, so they can launch a massive, overwhelming strike. Everything will be brought together. That is the plan. And the 1950s is when it really starts to come together. They've been having this idea, they've been working on this idea from the 1920s onwards. It's been heading this way. But in the 1950s, you start to have the communications gear, you start to have the aircraft, you start to have the actual weapon systems which can potentially deliver upon it. This is what I mean about the defense. Things are often a long time coming. They are a long time coming. This has been an idea they've been working towards, arguably, when you look at all the discussions they've been having in the 20s and 30s and even during World War II, for a long time. They have a division point in the late 1940s where you can go one way or you can go the other. They don't go that way. They don't go for the carriers. They go for these aircraft. And these aircraft are about keeping your opponents as far away from you as possible. In another way to put that is they're about keeping the naval battles and the maritime conflict as far away from the Soviet Union as possible, so the Soviet army doesn't have to garrison the shorelines and can concentrate its might on punching through the heart of Germany. That is it. This is what sometimes it's a difficult thing to get across. In that people go, well, why are they worrying about this? They could just defend the coastline. The Soviet army is massive. The Soviet army is massive, it is, but there is no such thing as infinite force. And if you've got logistics and all these things, you do not want to fight a multi-front war. You do not want to be launching yourself into the lowlands of Germany, heading towards the Netherlands, trying to get into, trying to take Antwerp and stop the American reinforcements getting into the fight, only to find that those American reinforcements and maybe some British reinforcements and some Canadian reinforcements and possibly some Australians, because they like to turn up at these occasions, they just do, and probably a couple of New Zealanders again, because, why not? It's a potential party. Let's go. Have decided to land on your northern flank, up sort of near Archangel, and are heading south. You don't want that to be happening, because you're going to have problems at that point. Your army is all going to be thrusting towards one thing. You're not going to have any troops in position to deal with that. Yes, they have armies and guards formations up in the north, but they're also supposed to be dealing with Norwegians. They're supposed to be dealing with probably Sweden and Finland, and they are going to be pushing that way. So they are on that. And if you think about it, the logistics up there is even more difficult to move forces back because it's mountainous, heavy terrain. So actually getting forces from there to come to position to block any manoeuvring assets that have landed above them or have landed behind them is going to be more difficult than bringing forces back from the centre of fricketing Germany to come to it. Because one's a straight train ride. Okay, it's train, you have to do a few changes, but it's doable. One is a nightmare to pull them back from within mountains. And mountain warfare is not good. Just ask and fighting in the lake districts of Finland is not good. So this is the reality the Soviets are faced with. So yeah, these are getting funding. These are getting support because they're about keeping that maritime battle, keeping those amphibious forces, keeping those carrier forces as far away from the Soviet Union as possible, making their task of trying to get close to there as difficult as possible. And the other thing those forces are about is about going out and striking convoys. Again, the Soviets were students of history. Not always good students of history, because they almost believed that it was going to be scientific in prediction of the future, and whereas they forget that humans are more artistic than scientific in some regards. Especially when it comes to their emotions and decision-making processes about governance and politics and international relations. And the thing is, these same forces which could go out and attack those carrier battle groups and those task groups could also go out and find convoys and smash convoys. And you think about it, the defences around a carrier battle group, there's going to be rings and rings of defences. Those are going to be onions. Layers and layers of air defences. The forces around a convoy are probably not going to be as thick. They're not going to necessarily have a massive, great big American fleet carrier or super carrier center. Probably not a British fleet carrier either at the center. There's few of those or a French one going around. Maybe in this period there might be some of the smaller carriers and there might be one of them popping on with that, but that's not going to be much. Surely you can overwhelm that with the mighty strike groups you can bring to bear. Their maritime reconnaissance, their electronic warfare, they're doing all sorts of things to make sure they find their opponents. This is about finding, fixing, and striking their opponents at as long a range from the Soviet Union as possible. They're about turning the ocean from something which is an access route for their enemies, their potential threats, into something which is a death trap for their opponents, where their forces will go to die. Because again, where is it easier to kill a division? When they're fighting on land and all spread out, dispersed, and with their weapon systems, or when they're all crewed up on a ship? All together on a ship in the middle of the ocean. When is it easier to kill a division? Every division you kill at sea is one division you don't have to face ashore. Every division worth of trucks you destroy at sea is one division, which is going to be logistically handicapped and not much use ashore. These things add up. Every shipment of food, every shipment of ammunition, every shipment of fuel you destroy is going to have an impact. So yeah, this is what they're thinking through in the 50s. And then the 60s, well, they take this to the absolute nth degree. This was the point at which it starts making, well, Tom Clancy's, of course, Red Storm Rising book, which is a very good fictional account, as good as any fictional account can be, of the scenario that they were going to face in terms of the Soviet plans and the NATO plans, comes about. But if you're looking for something which is more for someone who's reading from a historical study perspective, Air Defense at Sea by Rear Admiral J.R. Hill. Chapter 4 is pretty much entirely about the Soviet scenario and the Soviet-NATO scenario and the Falklands War scenario. And it's really interesting to read. It truly is quite scary to read as well, when you realise just how much is being focused on each other and how much is being focused in it. And the fact that you have these chapters, and as a traditional with me, you have letters in there as well, where people have borrowed books and sending back notes. But yes, the air defence battles. 2 air defence battles. It talks about the Falklands War as well in this book. And it's a really good pointer on it. What it starts to get into is the fact that prior to this you had the Badger, which is a very capable aircraft they produce in large numbers, but it's not really fast. Then they have the Tu-22, the Tu-22, which is the blinder. And that's the first really supersonic bomber that the Soviets produce in large numbers. And they produced a little over 300 of them. And they're useful, but they have issues. And you can tell they have issues that because the Tu-22M, which at some point NATO thought might be a Tu-26, backfire comes out. And that has nearly 500 copies built. And that's the sort of evolution of them. And this is where things get really mean. Now, the Russian Naval Aviation doesn't still operate these, but the Russian Air Force still does. Soviet Naval Aviation, these were the prize crews. These were the absolute elites. These were the people who were given the really best treatment. And there was a reason for this. They were the tip of the spear. It was felt that the Badgers and the Bears would be... the Bears would probably find the enemy because they've got numbers, but the Badgers might help out in finding them. And then the strikes would come in, and the Badgers would probably provide the mass of the strikes, probably with various of the anti-ship missiles that they have available. And they do develop some massive anti-ship missiles. If you want to look up a really interesting one, look up the KH-22 Storm. NATO referred to it as the kitchen. There is a reason. You are literally chucking the kitchen sink at someone. It is nearly 6 tons of missile coming at you at probably somewhere in the region of Mach 4.6, with a range of roughly 320 nautical miles from launch. It's an experience to realize that those things are aiming at you in the volume they could aim them, because they could, of all the different things they could fire them from. The point was you could also fire these from those big missiles from the backfires here. And the backfires, with their speed and their abilities and range, could be firing you from different angles. You see, the idea was you would have the Badgers launching from one direction, you would have ships launching from another direction, and you would have these probably launching from behind you. The idea very much was, in some salvo battle, was not a simple scenario of we just turn up and launch a massive salvo. No, it's you launch massive salvo from one direction, you draw the defences away, hopefully in that direction, and then you fire another massive salvo from another direction, and it's all coordinated. So they can't turn back from that salvo they're going to engage, because then those missiles will get through. But they're now out of position in terms of a cap or etc. of air systems to deal with the missiles coming from a different direction. And this is what caused the Americans to have to spend a lot of money developing Aegis and all sorts of systems to deal with this scenario. This is that higher threat. And in the 60s, especially the late 60s, there is probably a time when it would have boot stomped its opponents. But as is always the thing in history, you develop a new system, great. For a short time, it's going to be absolutely dominant, and then someone's going to come with a counter to it. It happens because humans don't stand still. They don't stand still and go, oh, this system now dominates me. I cannot come up with a way to deal with it. I must just be dominated. No, they don't. And it's both sides. It's a constant development. And this is the point again about what happens in the 70s, because the increasing range of the carrier strike group, the increasing range of capabilities, leads to a new improved Bear, the Tupolev 2142, or Bear F, which is improvements in all sorts of capabilities, and especially electronic warfare, etc. capabilities. It really does move up. But they're going, right then, so they've produced their carrier strike wings have got longer range, they've got more defensive capability, so we need to coordinate even more forces, and we can also bring heavy missiles, some really heavy, powerful missiles, if we're using our ships, and to project our ships that far out into our bastions, to defend our waters, to give ourselves the defensive depth we now need against these increased range strikes. We're going to need the Kievs. We're going to need something to provide those groups with their own reconnaissance capability and their own, to an extent, an outer air defense capability. And this is what the Soviets are starting to build. This is still a continuation of that defense in depth doctrine, of that using the sea space, using the maritime sphere as your defensive depth. Gorshkov, remember, has been pushing that. He knows that plays well with his audience, and that's what he's aiming for. And he's the guy in charge of a lot of the Soviet naval apparatus. There are often people who rise up at various points who would challenge him, and people debate as to whether he's really in charge or not, and there's other people around. But the thing is, Gorshkov is a wily old fox. He learns that the time he survives as head of the Soviet Navy is a very, very long time. And to survive that long in the Soviet system, you are very good not only at knowing when the bodies are buried, but when to recover them, and also when to forget them. And you're even better at burying those bodies, if they come for you. So, yeah. Scary gent. Scary gent. And I've done videos about him, I think, in the past. I've done a year sort of theorists, and I did a series about theorists, and I think I did Gorshkov was one of the theorists I looked at, the doctrine, development, strategy. I seem to remember that video. But in this period, what the Soviets are looking for is, again, to grow their defense in depth, is to grow their space, grow their security apparatus, and grow their ability to secure themselves and make it riskier. You cannot, and this is a fundamental defense, if an enemy is committed to coming, you cannot stop them coming. You can defeat them when they come, you cannot stop them coming. But the thing is, what you want to do is want to make the cost of them coming as expensive as possible. So, you've raised it up one level with the bombers and the submarines and the surface ships. They've countered and raised up their offensive capabilities in ways to try and overcome that. Okay, so now you're raising up your defensive capabilities again, you're including carriers. And very quickly, the Soviets start to realize that actually these things are useful. They've spent years saying their missiles are going to pummel carriers. Before that, their bombers were going to pummel carriers. Everything was going to pummel carriers. Now they're useful. Now they're becoming useful because, again, they're looking at that depth and they want that room to maneuver. They want that depth because, again, it's about trying to keep NATO submarines away from their ballistic missile submarine force, their SSBNs. It's about keeping strike submarines and carriers away from the Soviet Union, as far away from their territories as possible, and it's about keeping those amphibious forces as far away from those territories as possible. Because, again, look at how large the US Navy's and amphibious capability is. And think about what they're going to be doing with that in a Cold War scenario. Just using all those marine amphibious ships for reinforcing ports, moving troops to facilities already where you can offload from civilian ships? Does that really make sense? Yes, our plans are to wreck them on the first day, but surely they're not just thinking about that. And again, this is the point. It's not what matters sometimes is not just what your stated aims are or what your actual aims are to do with forces. What matters is your opponent's perception of those forces. One of the interesting things I've found in my reading is the Soviets often expect the British to be offloading their amphibious task group far further north than the British, according to the documents we actually have available, were ever planning it. The Soviets expected the British to be offloading the 3rd Commander Brigade far further north in Norway than the British were seemed to be planning to do so. Now, honestly, the reality is both sides could be wrong. There is a stretch of space in between where the British could go more northerly than they have been planning, because that makes sense at the time, because situations change and we were planning to, well, hang on, they're not going to be there, so we might as well use the ships to get us there, because otherwise it's going to take us ages to get across the mountains and through this area to that position, and logistically maneuver all the stuff we need to do. It's far easier to take it there by ship, and instead of going down that fjord, go a bit control a few more hours further north and go down that fjord. Yeah, this situation is quite possible. But also, there's a scenario of it's unlikely to be as far north as the Soviets were expecting, because I don't think the British were planning on getting that close to the heavy concentrations on Soviet missiles and Soviet bomber aircraft, etc. They were going to be in their range the whole time, but there's a getting close and there's getting into knife fighting range in terms of their ability to launch from their bases and attack you. And also, there's the risk of actually running into a Soviet carrier battle group and having to have a carrier fight. Or a battle group fight. That's not something you want to get involved in. That's not something you want to do if you can avoid it. So, realistically, the 70s is when you are seeing this escalation pattern coming into most in the fore. You're seeing this growth in defense capabilities from both sides. Both are stretching their capabilities, both the group of we are this defensive asset, and the other group going, right, we're going to be opening up another front. Because again, for NATO, the key thing is to open up other fronts. The key thing is to secure the northern flank. The key thing is to secure the southern areas. Why? Is it because they're offensively aggressive? No, it's not. It's because if you're trying to stop the romping, stomping Soviet army, you want to distract it. You want to divert its efforts. You want to split its logistics, don't you? That's what you want to do. It's kind of like, why do the Soviets consistently deploy ships and submarines to the Indian Ocean and other parts of the world, far away from their home territories? Because the amount of force that they're going to draw off should NATO have to go hunting them is far greater than the force that they're deploying. Because remember, you have to take enough forces to guarantee victory. And that reduces the amount of forces NATO can commit to, or Western powers can commit to, the offensive efforts. So it's a game of 3D chess, and both sides are equally playing it. And Soviet Naval Aviation Doctrine fits in all this. What they're using their aircraft for, how they're approaching their maritime patrols, how they're structuring their force acquisition, fits into all of this. Fits into that game of 3D chess. And with that in mind, we move into the Bastions. So these things sort of solidified really in the 70s, 80s, but often attributed to the war conspiring, but they've been coming about for a long time before then. And honestly, I think you can spend too much time emphasizing the impacts of spirings. They're sexy, they sell books, so they're often going to come as a concept, but in many ways it's a natural evolution of what the Soviets had already been doing. And as you can see, I've taken a map which was available and I have modified it. I found a lovely, nice map of the GI-UK gap, which highlights that quite nicely. And I thought I'd give you the fact that the Barents Sea was supposed to be a bastion. The critical convoy battles were going to take place in North Atlantic, supplying across this route from basically New York to Liverpool, and well, except to New York to Liverpool, but also New York to Antwerp is going to be probably the biggest one, etc. To resupply forces in Germany from America. You send the forces to Liverpool before they get changed over to tactical shipping to go to Norway. That's probably what's going to happen, because that's the sensible position to do it, because that's behind Scotland, behind Norway. It's a nice space. It's a relatively, in this context, a relatively safe space with facilities to offload to do the transfer. Close enough that it's going to be able to be done quickly and efficiently. This leads us to the area of contention, which is where the Soviets would like to be engaging and pushing back against NATO. They want to keep NATO forces in that area. Why? Because if they're in the area of contention, the Norwegian Sea, Iceland, so that area, then whilst, yes, they're going to be getting support from northern Norway and Iceland in terms of the NATO forces, and Greenland to extent, they're also not going to be able to easily strike at Murmansk, Archangel, the Kola Peninsula, where they've got key bases, etc., and the wider part of northern areas of the Soviet Union. And most importantly, if they are fighting and focusing in the Norwegian Sea, they're not going to be able to make a break into the Bastion. And any forces breaking into the Bastion become a massive threat. The Barents Sea is a critical place under ice where you can hide a lot of ballistic missile submarines. And so, this is what we have going on. Don't think of the bastions necessarily as this, we will not fight from them. Think of them like a castle fort or castle wall you sally forth from. They're the outer walls. That's what they're, the outer defences. And you are sallying forth from. You do not want those outer defences really to be tested, because you know those outer defences are not your strongest defences. They're not. But if stuff inside them is stuff you'd really like to keep, and you are trying to keep it safe as best you can by keeping the enemy beyond that. And so you want to use those positions to push forward. So this is what we see. The bastions are about, to an extent, the Soviet realization that there were strike capabilities aimed at their missile systems. But they'd already sort of realised that was going on. You know, this is the thing about the spy rigs, etc. Often the spy information confirms what you already suspected, and what you're already sort of planning towards. It also reveals to them that, to an extent, the spy ring, that reveals that the Allies know, NATO and forces, etc., know how noisy their submarines are. But again, that's no surprise really to the Soviets, because the Soviet Navy knows how noisy its submarines are, because it has to listen to them far more often than anyone else does. They're trying to make them as quiet as they can. So it provides impetus, it provides extra coverage for the next generation of submarines, etc. and things, but most importantly from a naval aviation perspective, it's one of the reasons why the Badgers don't retire. The Badgers get upgraded, get modernized. The Badger, in many ways, keeps going on and on and on because it is useful. It is reliable, fairly solid, and you can fairly flexible. And you can keep adding extra things to it. You can keep refitting it with more. It's a fairly serviceable airframe, basically. And so they are building up again their depth. They're building up their defensive depth and trying to push it out. And when you start talking about operations, the Kiev class makes sense when you're operating your carriers from within the Bastion, because they're going to have access to lots of support from land-based aircraft. Land-based fighters, land-based airborne early warning, land-based long-range maritime reconnaissance patrol aircraft and reconnaissance aircraft. But that's not really enough. Once you start looking at operating Norwegian Sea, you're going to want to bring your own with you. You're going to want to have your own with you to provide yourself with that security, with that depth for your operations. You're still coordinating with large amounts of land forces. You're still coordinating the massive punch, the massive battle. And you're still going to be using those air forces in their free-ranging strike roles to try and hit convoys and all those things. But the thing is, the further away you're operating from the land-based forces, the more you need to have your own with you in order to survive in that tactical atmosphere. And this is where the 1980s comes in. Now here again we're seeing something different in the carrier development, because, well, the Soviets go for a STOBAR, that short takeoff barrier assisted recovery form. Now, believe it or not, this is probably the worst form of carrier configuration. Let me explain why. Before people start hating on me, there's a reason why. If you consider for catapult-assisted takeoff and barrier-assisted recovery, CATABAR, like the American carriers are and the Charles de Gaulle is, and the plans for the next-generation Chinese carrier are to be, well, you build an aircraft which has an airframe strong enough to take the landings, take the difficulty of the landings, the controlled crashes that is a barrier-assisted recovery. But they have the advantage of being able to take off heaviest because they have all the assistance of the catapults to take them and launch them off. Right? So it works out. If you take the STOVL, or as we're mostly seeing these days, short takeoff, rolling landing, so it's STORL, rather than necessarily STOVL, short takeoff, vertical landing. These aircraft have to be the lightest because they have to take off themselves and land, but they also have the softest landings. So you can have an airframe designed around that, and you can have a payload of things designed around that. Now, the advantage of CATABAR is the aircraft can launch and recover at the heaviest. The advantage of STOL is that they can take off the most quickly because you don't have to reset any catapults. So STOVL is actually fairly good if you're looking at a air defense primary role. If your primary role is being able to launch fighters rapidly to provide air defense and reconnaissance and these things, that's actually a good thing. STOVL actually works well if you've got good aircraft, because the aircraft also, believe it or not, their lightest loadout is going to be their air-to-air loadout. Missiles, very rarely air-to-air missiles weigh as much as bombs, and they are often far more aerodynamically fine. So the air-to-air loadout is often a lot lighter than the attack loadout. STOBAR, well, that means your aircraft have to be light enough to use the short takeoff, but they also have to be designed strong enough to survive, and therefore have a heavy enough airframe to survive the barrier-assisted recovery. So theoretically they can land heavier, but they're still limited by the takeoff weights for doing the short takeoff and launch. And, you know, you can put in the ramp and all the things you want, but these things are still going to be an issue. See what I mean? STOBAR. It's got the limitations of short takeoff and limitations of barrier-assisted recovery imposed on the aircraft. So it is very much the worst form of carrier operation you can have. This doesn't stop people using it, of course. It still works well if you adapt your aircraft and your operations around it, and if you're sensible of why you've chosen this particular methodology. The interesting thing always for me is the Kuznetsov class basically take the STOBAR so they can carry a larger, better fighter aircraft, basically, because let's be honest, the Forge was not good. You know, the Yak 38, if we go back to it, was an interesting aircraft when it came to its roles. It was potentially viable, but honestly, you wanted it as your second line, immediately over the head fighter, not a combat air patrol, not something which is providing some kind of forward layers of defense. And so they start working on the Su-33, which is basically a navalized Su-27. Okay, it's basically the Sukhoi 33 is NATO. It's literally called the Flanker D, and that's because the Su-27 is called the Flanker. NATO are even more honest in naming than the Russians are, because there are reasons for this. You want your aircraft to sound newer and cooler. You don't want to sound, well, we took an aircraft, we bumped up its engines, lightened its weight as much as we could, made sure its airframe was as strong as physically possible, and hoped it would work. It does work. It does. But again, this is part of the growing problem for the Soviets, was, ensuring these bastions had sufficient force, assuring they were able to do the penetrative warfare into the Norwegian Sea, etc. they needed to do to try and keep those bastions as safe as possible, to keep NATO forces as far away as possible. And that is what leads to the next generation plans for the next carrier. Now, this is the Ulyanovsk class, and to build them, they had to have an assembly welding workshop constructed at the Black Sea shipyard, which allows the hull sections to be increased to 200-ton sections. They had to have a new self-propelled flatbed truck. They had to work done on the slipway, and lengthened, all sorts of things were planned. And when you're looking at it, you're going, wow, you're doing all this work. You must be getting a Katabar carrier to really do this work. No, they're not. They're not getting a Katabar carrier. They're getting a Kata stow bar carrier. It's got barrier-assisted recovery. It's got catapults for its Yak-44 airborne early warning aircraft to take off with, and don't worry, it's still got the stow bar arrangement for the Sukhoi Su-33s. It's really, really strange. And there are all sorts of other discussions. There were some discussions about whether or not they would have an extra catapult added in, but they're getting steam catapults from being produced by a factory in Leningrad, as well as a ski jump. You cannot have steam catapults because of the way it functions, and you can't even just with electromagnetic catapults have them go up a steam ramp. They just up a ski jump, I mean. So that's why they are positioned off on the angle. 3 lifts, of which 2 could take all aircraft aboard, and 1 potentially couldn't. Theoretically, there is a debate on its design, because as it's shown in most of the plans, it looks pretty darn narrow to carry the Yak-44, as is illustrated by this illustration. But there's a chance. But the others look a lot wider and a lot more capable of taking that aircraft. Again, there are different designs. There are some designs where that's the biggest lift by far, so there are all sorts of different ideas floating around about this ship and what our system was supposed to be. And honestly, again, they are about very slowly pushing the envelope. They're still about what you need to provide within that scenario, because the strike power comes from the missiles the carriers are carrying. That's their strike potential for the big strike. This is the carrier's air wing is about providing reconnaissance to focus that strike. It's about providing coordination for that strike. It's about providing air defense and fighters to defend the surface groups and keep the long-range maritime patrol aircraft and strike aircraft, preferably of the NATO forces, from interfering. It's about mitigating those problems. It's this contest of sea control, of who can actually control the sea. And that's where it comes in. That's what it evolves from. And they are about growing this capability. How do they fit into the doctrine then? Well, they're still fitting into the doctrine of sea control. They're still fitting into the firepower. They're not so much... This is moving far more to sort of thing slightly more independent, able to go further afield. It's got its own airborne early warning, which is a useful addition to have. But the Yak-44, once you start reading up about it, you realise this is an aircraft which was supposed to be taking over quite a lot of the strike control role as well, which is important for the Soviet naval aviation. A key part of their capacity for operations is to coordinate the strikes as far forward as possible to make sure they hit their targets, because it's been a constant race the whole way through this period of we have the information. It doesn't matter if you've got satellites as well adding into it. You've got this information about where the enemy is. You want to have as up-to-date information as possible about where the enemy is when you're focusing in that strike to give them the best chance of hitting. You don't want to be firing here when the enemy's there, because then the missiles will just float off into the Gulf, into the horizon, and wide blue yonder and disappear. Maybe there's a convoy somewhere back there that one or two of them managed to reach. But unlikely. You want to make sure your strike coordination, everything is as tight as possible, so that you can guarantee you bring your forces to bear at the point you need to. So it's here, you want to do this. You want to completely surround it. And you can only do that if you know where this is. And you might go, well, Alex, that fingers up, on the size ocean of fleets are task groups are going to be spread around. But no, in the size of space we're talking about, in the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic, yeah, my finger's probably a bit big comparative to all you're searching. Even with the task group spread out for full protection against a nuclear attack. See, it's all about that coordination. And the best way to achieve it is to be as far forward as possible, because then the strike commander can be getting all the information they need from the reconnaissance aircraft and putting it together. Now, you might go, well, hang on, Alex, why aren't they doing this from the carrier? Why are they doing the strike coordination from aircraft? And the reason you do it from the aircraft is because if it's on a ship and it's being coordinated for a ship, that's going to realistically reveal the ship's location very quickly. And that's going to cause, well, that ship to probably have a short life expectancy. Whereas aircraft, the speed they're moving, can mitigate against that. And you can adjust your position as strike commander to be in a suitable position. Now, I would say the strike commander is still an absolute target. And, well, the trouble is, again, as we talked about before, the Soviets have tried various ways to mitigate that in the past. That's included the idea of those lovely parasite fighters being attached. Yes, that is about all the sort of things you can do to try and protect yourself in that scenario. Well, with the naval aviation, with its strength, there's a reason why in 1990, when we're talking about this coming to sort of the end, the strength of the Soviet naval aviation is 80 Yak-38s, 113 Ka-25s, 106 Ka-27s. Again, if you look at the Kiev class video, I talk about them there. And that's the sea-based going strength of the force. The land-based is 125 Tu-16 bombers and 15 Tu-22s, so it's 140 pure bombers. 195 attack craft, that's 95 Su-17s and 100 Su-24s. 180 anti-submarine aircraft, that's 50 Tu-142s, Bears. 40 Il-38 Mays. And 90 B-12s. BE-12s, which is the Beryev's flying boat. That's always fun. 65 reconnaissance aircraft. That's 50 Tu-16Rs. That's reconnaissance versions of the Badgers. And 15 Antonov 12s, AN-12s, which are interesting aircraft for that jot roll. 45 electronic warfare aircraft. Again, 10 Tu-22s. 20 Tu-95s. And 15 Su-24s. 118 land-based anti-submarine helicopters. That's the Mi-14, which is the larger anti-submarine warfare helicopter. 118 of those. And 40 area refueling tankers, mostly Tu-16s, being modified to that role. Again, the Badger rolls on, doesn't it? The Badger providing the bulk of the force. And that always, to me, gives you a very good impression of what their big problem was. Because, yes, they have a lot of long-range strike aircraft. They do. But even in 1990, this is just before the fall of the Soviet Union, they are still far more focused on reconnaissance, on electronic warfare, getting the strike through, and getting the other systems through. Those are key assets. If we consider reconnaissance and electronic warfare alone account for 110 aircraft, the bomber fleet counts for 140, and of those, only 15 are backfires. 125 are badges. 125 are badges. This is what they had available in the Soviet naval aviation. Now, let's be honest, if you're talking about some major strikes, they might be able to get to borrow some aircraft from the Soviet Air Force as well to come along. If they think there's a major carrier battle group coming in and they want to do a mass strike, they might be able to do that. But again, not necessarily the Soviet Air Force aircraft are not necessarily fitted up to do the same roles. They're fitted up for different functions. But what are the gaps in the 1990s? Well, if you think the gaps in 1990 were, you've got the Yak-38 as your only fixed-wing aircraft, and you had no airborne early warning aircraft for your carriers. Now, that was supposed to be coming in and sort out when the Yak-44 came into service for the Ilmanovsk design. But that course gets cancelled. And even before that was cancelled, they were working on an improved Kamov, which could take something, and that's the K-31, which probably would have been produced in far larger numbers as a modernization system than has that been the case. It's literally been built primarily as the AWACS aircraft, airborne early warning, and it's been a stalwart addition to the air group of the Kuznetsov. The Su-33. It's a good aircraft for what the Russians want to do with it. But again, it's a problem in that carrying these aircraft are limited by the functionality of the system they've been plugged into. What you wanted these ships to do, what ships were built to do, was very much a defensively minded role. And then when you want them to do other things, the system doesn't really stack up as well. The strike capability of a Stobar carrier is about the same as a Stovall carrier. In fact, it's literally the same as a Stovall carrier, because you have the same limitations on the aircraft in terms of their launching capability. So you have none of the advantage of a Katabar carrier in terms of its strike weight. You still have the ability to launch air defense aircraft, the aircraft in their air defense role as fast as you possibly can, and recover them. You could say more easily if they're damaged. That's the other advantage of Barris's recovery. If the aircraft are damaged, it's easier to recover them and recover the crews and potentially repair them if you've got that system than if they're a damaged aircraft which was planning to do a vertical landing. A rolling landing, that depends on how short up the brakes are. But honestly, their plans for going into the 1990s, out of the 1980s, was to be the next generation. It was to grow their forces, to improve their forces. The 1990s were going to be the age when Soviet naval aviation was seen around the world. That's when carriers were going to start taking the lead in their global power projection. That's what the Ulmos class and its successors were planned for. They're nuclear-powered carriers. And honestly, I'm very doubtful myself as to whether the second of the Ulmos class gets completed in a... I don't even know how to pronounce it. Is it a Stow Catabar? Is it a Catastow bar? Is it what kind of scenario are you going to call that system? I wouldn't be surprised if the second one got completed as a proper Katabar carrier with 3 catapults. 1 waist, 2 forward. Standard form. Waist 1 can deal with launching the heavies like your Yak 44s. Forward ones can launch your fighters and your strike aircraft. But that would of course require the creation of a Katabar aircraft. Now, interesting enough, you'd think the Sukhoi Su-33, because it's designed for barrier-assisted recovery, would actually be a good option for it. And the answer to that is, not particularly. Not particularly, because the way their nose and the airframe was designed forward, the loads you put on an aircraft to launch it via catapult would all come in at the wrong point for the airframe, and could well rip the front of the airframe off the rest of the body. I.e., I'm talking about the forward fuselage, including the cockpit area. Now, that means they'd have had to do more work. That means they'd have had to do more development. Next generation aircraft. I have no doubt they would have done it. Honestly, one of the things about the Soviets, I never doubt they'll produce something. The aircraft and the quality and the capability can range from being incredibly innovative but otherwise very, very problematic solutions. The Yak-38 Forger, incredibly innovative system for launching and for its aircraft and its operation of its engines, let down horrendously by some issues with manufacture and the fact that, honestly, the system needed to be refined a lot more before they pushed into service, and they needed to work through it a lot more. And that's why the Forger came out the way it did. But overall, Soviet naval aviation, you have to consider, has been rather successful. And the fact that so many of its aircraft are still kept going by Russia, even with tight budgets, has been kept going and have been still providing something which we have to pay attention to. You cannot afford to ignore them. To this day, is a testimony to that. But it's also a testimony to the fact that the Russian Navy and Russian naval aviation is still dealing with the same problems. The problem is, how do you secure Russia? Now, that question is a long-lasting one, because ultimately, and this is such a tried and true saying that people almost can treat it as being trite, but it is correct. The best defense is a good offense. The best defense is to keep your enemy playing defense, so they can't do an offense. And if you can't do that, you then have to be prepared for your enemy to dictate where the fight's going to be, because you're going to be waiting for them to come to you. That's why you need so many reconnaissance assets and to coordinate the strike assets, and that's why you need all the other systems you need with Soviet naval aviation, all the preponderance of focus on information gathering and patrol, because you can't afford to do it any other way. You really can't. The strikes will come, the enemy will show up where they choose to, and you have to be able to respond to them. So the whole way through, their naval aviation has been built around this idea of helping to secure their sea strategic depth. Bastions, as it became known later in the Cold War, but even prior to the Cold War, spheres of influence, spheres of control, spheres of security, definitely are things which should be discussed in terms of. For that, the strike was the advantage, but as you get closer, more and more aircraft are able to be deployed. More and more aircraft are available. Right then, I always finish these videos off with a question, and I'm not going to make a difference this time. I'm going to finish this question. When I don't finish them with a question, I make a point of why I'm not finishing a question. So, the interesting point here is the Soviets are all about defense in depth. They're all about security of the motherland. And That's a laudable aim. It really is. The question here is, let's say Stalin gets to be in his bonnet about aircraft carriers a little bit earlier. And the Soviets do have an aircraft carrier. Or two. Let's say two. Operational. In the late 1930s. How do you think that affects the world? Now, I would say in that period the Soviets would probably build it to be treaty compliant, which means 27,000 tons limitation. And I'd say they're probably going to be built in the Black Sea, because that's going to be the best thing, but also in Petersburg. Probably there's going to be two, that's where they're both going to be built. One's going to be built in one built in the other. And honestly, my strong suspicion would be one would be used as the flagship of the Northern Fleet when they restart that, and when they set that up again, and one would be used as the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. That would be where they want to position them. Because you could use one in the Black Sea, but that's going to basically become the ruler of the Black Sea at that time period. And that could also have interesting impacts with the how do I put this politely? With the Turkish navy, who do operate a battle cruiser at this point occasionally when it's not being ignored. So yes, let's say they have two and they have another couple in construction. Let's say that's what Stalin pushed for because he wanted to. They were honestly the first aircraft carriers they're looking at. They're looking at them as maritime reconnaissance assets and patrol assets to be able to position in these places because, rather like they're using flying boats, they don't have the infrastructure. They have infrastructure to support ships up to a certain size, and I'd say a 27,000 ton aircraft carrier, well, you could probably stretch your infrastructure to support that. You probably could. Or do at least modifications to it to do so. Whereas, building all the bases for things, a bit difficult. And if everyone else has got aircraft carriers, yeah. So I'd like to see what you think happens. How you think the Soviets would use them? And how do you think the world will react to them? And would the Soviets have kept operating carriers post World War II on that scenario? I think that depends on what they get used for during World War II. But would they have kept them? How would that have affected the world? I'd be really interested to hear what you think, because I think even if they do have carriers, I think they still do use them defensively. I don't think they will ever have a strong enough force. They'll feel confident to go, we're going to push into the North Atlantic and interrupt things that way. No, it's always going to be a case of, right, then you're going to come here and we're going to have gradually building up more and more and more defenses to smash you until you get thrown away. As mentioned at the beginning, in the Shameless book plug, I am working for Bookshelves at the moment. That is what I am putting all my money towards. So thank you to everyone who supported me on this. There are many have arrived. There are many still to come. I think on there I put there was 7 black ones required as well, and there is at least one 4x3 black bookshelf and a couple of others, and all the legs still I need to go, because I want the legs because of course I have dogs, and because I will whilst I never like to think, but someday I could well have puppies. Not with the current dogs, so they're both boys, but someday eventually that there could be a puppy again in the family, and in that scenario it's better to have calyxes which are a little bit off the ground. Just a little bit off the ground. But no. Thank you very much to everyone who's kindly supported it. I have now moved house, and that has been sufficiently expensive that I would prefer to never have to do it again, honestly. I think the furthest you'll get me to move is if next door comes for sale and I have to buy that. And for some reason I've won the lottery and I can buy that. That's about the distance I'm prepared to move. Then I don't have to do anything. I literally just can slowly move it at my own pace. I don't have to put in boxes. I don't have to get disorganized, and I can just slowly move it in next door. Don't know if our new neighbours realise this, but you know, maybe across the road. Across the road looks quite nice as well. If I win the lottery. What have we got coming up next week? Next week we have Charles de Gaulle. That'll be fun. And bonus, I thought you'd all find this interesting. Okay, there are some people telling me, oh, these things have gone out of service. Like, no, there is the Xi'an H6, which is the China's license-built, still in production, still being modified, still at the front of their operations version of the 216. So the Badger is very much still with us in spirit, at least, if not in full body. But the Badger is still there. And again, if we looked at Chinese Naval Aviation Doctrine, which is something which is a whole maelstrom to get into, and at some point I might do a video about that, but that would be a big project, and there are some books I would want to get before I get into that. They're still there. They're still an important part of that, and they're an important part of their overall strength and overall capabilities. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and, well, I'm going to leave you on probably one of the more interesting pictures. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Have a good evening.